Então, pessoal, sejam muito bem-vindos ao nosso último encontro do primeiro Seminário Internacional de Pesquisa e Comunicação, Esporte e Mídia, uma realização do Grupo de Pesquisa Tecnologia Cotidiano, aqui da Universidade Doidge do Paraná. E hoje nós temos a presença muito ilustre e com muita satisfação que recebemos aqui, eu e o Rolando, meu co-host e colega, recebemos o professor Doidge, da Universidade de Brighton, para apresentar alguns dos resultados da sua pesquisa em andamento, né, sobre discurso de ódio no futebol, nas plataformas online. Eu acho que é um tema muito interessante, que vai além das discussões sobre esporte e comunicação que nós fizemos nos outros 3 encontros. A gente vai falar sobre política, sociedade, e eu acho que tem muitas coisas bem legais para todos vocês aproveitarem. O pessoal está entrando aqui, mas, como sempre, eu também chamo vocês a entrarem no nosso canal do YouTube, onde vão ficar todas as palestras disponíveis para vocês depois. A anterior da semana passada, do Daniel Nola, que já está lá. YouTube, GP, Comunicação e Esporte, alguma coisa assim, tudo junto, mas depois eu passo o link para vocês no e-mail também. Então, sejam muito bem-vindos. Vou passar ao professor Rolando para fazer a introdução do nosso convidado e depois a gente vai conversar, vai assistir a apresentação do Mark. Rolando, por favor, seja bem-vindo mais uma vez.
Bom dia a todos. Boa tarde. Good afternoon, Mark. É um prazer enorme estar aqui novamente, né? Participando desse seminário. Para mim é uma honra grande, né? Eu já falei isso, né? Sou do esporte, da área esportiva, mas é muito bom ver outras nuances do esporte, né? Então, hoje nós temos a presença do Dr. Mark Doidge, né? Daí, assim, eu vou fazer a apresentação em inglês aqui, né? Tá? Is currently a Principal Research Fellow and a Trustee for the British Sociological Association, BSA. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton. Dr. Doidge's latest research focuses on the role football can play in our understanding of important social issues such as hate crime, climate change, and refugees and migration. He has won a funding to study on football and hate crime, né? Então, como o professor Márcio falou, né? Vamos falar sobre o ódio, né, no futebol e coisas assim, né? Então, welcome, Professor Dr. Mark. The word is yours. You can start whatever you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Bom
much.
dia, everyone. I am sorry, but that is the limit of my Portuguese, other than cerveja. So thank you very much for the warm welcome. I understood a little of what you said, and Brazilian Portuguese is much easier to understand than Portuguese.
Yeah.
And thank you for inviting me to do this talk. It's really nice to be able to talk to people from around the world and to present different ideas and get different insights, because I genuinely believe that that is how one academic knowledge can be refined and made better, because the insights that you give and that we give, we can improve things. And secondly, I think it also, as you'll see from my work, and I'll talk a little bit about that as a start, is about academic research to make a change and to improve society. And I think by getting the different insights and from hearing from different voices and from different perspectives, we can start to refine our knowledge and make a real change. I will share my slide. Let me just check that works. So I'll go through the slides, but I will also introduce myself a little bit at the start. I understood some of what Marcia and Rolando said, but to give a bit of background, my research is very much around making a change through football, and in particular working with football fans, but also understanding some of the complicated and difficult things that happen in football. Because I think what I would argue is that football as the most popular sport in the world, and the fact that we can have a conversation between England and Brazil right now means that we have a shared language. Even if we don't speak Portuguese or English, we can at least talk about football, and we can understand some shared values and ideas and issues. And because of that, we can communicate with lots of people. So my research initially started with a PhD studying Italian football. Which became a book, Football Italia, in 2015, where partly I started researching around ultras, which led to a recent publication on ultras that I wrote with colleagues in Poland and Germany. But I'm also interested in the role of politics in football, partly because of my time in Italy, as saying before. And I wrote an article with Barbara, who's at Paraná, about Romario and politics and football and the overlap there, because I think what we can start to see is how football is being used by politicians. We're in the middle of a World Cup where nation states are using football to present themselves in a positive light. But equally, we can also start thinking about football fans and how they challenge things. So some of my early work was around fans fighting racism in football, and how fans can potentially be the solution, as often, and I'm sure this might be the case in Brazil as in England and in Europe, football fans are often seen as the problem, that they are the ones that have to be regulated or policed or stopped, as opposed to being seen as the potential solution, and working with fans, communicating with fans and engaging fans to come up with solutions. So part of that has been around anti-racism initiatives. I've also had some funding around football fans working with refugees, and how they have in Europe used football and sport to bring refugees through and to bring them into local communities. And I'm currently working on a project around football fans and climate change, and I've got a couple of articles coming out on that. But I've also, as Rolando mentioned about this funding, I've actually got two projects that have been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in England about hate crime in football. So one is a network grant where we bring some people together to talk about hate crime. And one of those has been Professor John Garland at Surrey University in England, who's done some amazing work in this area, and some of his work I draw on here. But also the main part of this talk is around another project called Tackling Online Hate in Football. And I'm guessing it's similar in Brazil to here, which is there is a lot of online abuse, what we call online hate, in England, directed often at players, but also at other people like journalists and other fans. And social media, in particular Twitter, has been a place where these discussions have taken place. And what I will talk about here, and sort of partly to, there it is. Partly what I'll talk about here is the context in the UK. I will talk about the term hate crime and what we mean by it, because I am aware that it might not be something that is maybe commonly used in Brazil, and therefore just to define the term might be helpful. And then I will also talk a little bit about the online hate project and the initial research, which was a scoping review to outline where the issues currently are, and where we have currently seen research in English, I will hasten to add, on this topic, but equally where some of the gaps are and where we're going next, and potentially opening this up to you for questions, for comments, and I'll be delighted to hear from anyone if you've got any comments or any questions about any of my work. But sort of to put this into context, in the UK and in Europe, there has been a growth in what's called hate crime, and I'll define that in a minute, and abuse directed at referees and players. Often this is race couched in other terms, so it's in racist or sexist or homophobic. And we've seen, particularly online, that this has grown in magnitude, partly because of COVID, and there was a lockdown. So and we'll see this in a chart I show later, how the number of incidents around hate in the UK fell very dramatically during COVID, but is obviously on the increase again. And in particular, last year in the European Championships, England got to the final, and then in the final lost on penalties to Italy, and 3 players missed penalties and then were subjected to a lot of hate online. All of those 3 players were black, and a lot of the abuse was racist and linked to their skin color. So we can sort of see how online and offline often are merged, and what people might think offline becomes visible online, and this becomes, I think, quite a useful area for research. And there has been a sort of a player mobilization around this, following on from Colin Kaepernick in the US, particularly around the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly after the murder of George Floyd by a police officer in the US. But also Colin Kaepernick had been taking a protest about police violence towards African Americans, but equally it was also about highlighting that injustice. And I'll finish this talk with where we might be going with this project, because it is one of the areas we want to do more research in, because we have noticed very clearly from the Twitter material data that we have collected that a lot of the political discourse from outside of football is inside the football discourse. So when players, and this again happened with the England national team at the European Championships last year, that the England national team, the players decided that they would take the knee, but this is a representation from obviously from different sports. But the England football men's team took the knee to show, again, highlight issues of racism in football and in society. And a lot of abuse was attracted online accordingly, with a lot of the discourse from wider politics entering into that, particularly around how politics shouldn't be part of sport, often quoting politicians in this, and say nothing makes something not political than a politician saying it, obviously. But obviously what we see is that there's a broader narrative that's not just about football or about sport, but actually what we can see through sport is how these wider social changes are being communicated, are being demonstrated, being performed online and offline. So I'll talk a little bit about the online hate project in particular. This is a 3-year project. We are 1 year in, so we are still collecting data, and we have done a systematic review of which I will do present a lot of the findings in a minute. But it's very much around trying to find out, combining quantitative analysis of Twitter material, so Twitter data, and also qualitative interviews. We have collected a lot of interviews with journalists, with some footballers, with other people working within football, campaigners, people working in campaigns. I'll be honest that the one area we have found it very difficult to talk with people is with players. We get a sense that some players are very happy to talk about this, some are not and don't want to talk about the abuse they receive, but some do. But there is also a certain amount of gatekeeping with football clubs where they want to control what their players are saying and what aren't being said. So it's becoming quite difficult on that sense. But we're still working on that, and we think we've got a couple of leads on that as well. Just to put this into perspective, this is the group of people. So I'm part of a wider team. So this is a big funding project, and other colleagues from across Ireland and England and Northern Ireland are engaged in this. So this is a joint funded project with the Irish Research Council and with the English Arts and Humanities Research Council. And I say part of this is also about learning about Twitter, about identifying. So some of the team are more computer scientists, and they're looking at the Twitter data and also machine learning and artificial intelligence to identify certain patterns in the data, and looking for patterns around when abuse occurs, what type of abuse, and using certain models. And again, I will be honest, I don't know anything about this. They're the experts in this area, to start identifying this. So that is something that we hope at the end of this project we can go back to clubs and policymakers, and also Twitter, which is unlikely to change now. They've had a change of ownership. I say, look, we can predict what will happen in some cases around abuse towards footballers. So therefore, you've got, you should have a duty of care to protect users, and therefore you can do something about this. And ultimately, what we want to then do is to try and prevent this. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute about how the impact of hate crime as it moves through, and it's not just the individual, but equally it's a wider group of people. Am I going at the right pace? Am I understood and speaking clearly? Excellent. Yeah, thanks, Martin. I want to talk a little bit about hate crime in particular, because I'm not aware if this is the term that translates outside of England even, but it's a particular type of law and a particular type of academic area of analysis, which is very much thinking about, and as Barbara Perry here says, it's acts of violence and intimidation towards stigmatized and marginalized groups. So what we're seeing here is a particular type of crime, and then in the UK there is a specific crime about that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it is also about usually associated with particular vulnerable groups or marginalized groups, and usually around particular protected characteristics such as race and sexuality. Here's a different definition from Mark Walters, so I'm grateful to John Garland for these, because this came from the other project. They said any type of crime or antisocial behavior or act that's intimidating and harming the victim, and has been motivated by a prejudice. So this again highlights how this type of law is slightly different from others, in that there are two sort of aspects to it. One is about the motivation being about prejudice, but equally about how the victim might feel, and often it's associated with broader issues such as racism or homophobia. And here is actually from the sort of from the policing angle. And there's a couple of specific police. I think there's one police and hate crime officer in the UK in the Midlands part around Birmingham. But hate crime is any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by a hostility or prejudice based on a person's race, sexual orientation, faith, transgender status, or disability. And often there is a certain specific hate crimes laws as well around particular aggravated offences. So if someone, for example, gets into a fight, if there's a perception or a belief that that might be racially motivated, for example, then they will add on the extra aspects around hate crime, which means obviously higher penalties in some cases. And in some cases, there is also a case of incitement to hatred. So trying to get other people to do the hate for you. What's obviously quite interesting about this particular definition is that it excludes gender. So sexism, misogyny are not included in the current situation, which is obviously does have an impact on football, because that does come about quite a lot. And just to give you some indications of some of the current levels, We're talking, in terms of there's an increase in each of these, but equally the biggest one is very much around race in the UK, but also one of the biggest groups, biggest percentage changes around transgender status, which has become a particular political issue in the UK, or being politicized rather. So we can maybe potentially, I think we will see more next year around race and transgender again. And I sort of alluded to it already. What makes hate crime slightly different from other types of crime? It's not necessarily about property or about physical acts. It's often about based on perceived prejudice or a perceived feeling about how that action is being received by the victim. And often it's about an attack on a victim's group identity, so racism, so particularly about someone's race or ethnicity or sexuality. And often it can be seen as a sort of a gateway, in that it opens up a potential issue about how the perpetrator might be actually sending a signal to wider members of that community. So it's not necessarily just about, okay, let's abuse a footballer because they happen to be black, but it's also about a wider signal that this is you are not accepted in our society if you are black, and we're making this very clear that we don't accept the footballers, and therefore we don't accept you as well. And because of this as well, this is again often about activities or perceptions that the victim has no control over. No one chooses to be, what race they're born into. So, and often they again, it's about feelings, and often they hurt more. I'll come on to this in a minute. Often this is about, particularly when it comes to online hate, often this sometimes is coming from a stranger. So it's not often a crime that is associated with someone who might be known to you. They might not even be in the same country as you. So they're attacking not just you, but your entire wider social group. And this last bit I think is really important, is that it's often a process rather than a one-off event. But I think this is something that's worth thinking about in relation to online hate with football, is that often, and what we'll see is that often there is an emotional response to, say, a penalty kick being missed, or a particular situation in a football match that has caused the individual to get angry and then abuse the individual. But this is not often an isolated act. And it is often done to other people as well. And if a particular group is targeted in a physical sense, often it is a series of things that is happening. It's not just, okay, we're going to call you a horrible word in the streets, but there might be other acts. That's a continual process, that this is a feeling that it continues. And it could be other acts as well, such as intimidation, or sending things through people's letterboxes, as happens. And I think this is one of the things that also makes hate crime slightly different, is about the impact on the victims, because sometimes it's associated with physical intimidation or physical violence, but often it is very psychological and emotional, and therefore that can have a massive impact on people's mental health. It can make people feel more vulnerable and isolated. Often, and one of the things that we have seen come through some of the interviews is how individuals who have been the victims of hate crime online don't know who to turn to. They don't know who to ask for help. They often don't feel that they have a network that they can go to. Because often it is, again, random people. They're not known from the other person. It's not like it's someone that you can avoid. And that can, in the broader sense, lead to severe mental health issues, but also to other issues. And again, it's a slippery slope, from shifting from just mental health issues, but potentially about self-confidence issues, potentially making people, from a football perspective, it could actually have an impact on how they play, which then spirals, because if they then have a bad game, they get more abuse, or they beat themselves up more, so therefore they don't play as well the next game, they get dropped, and then therefore you can get into a particular situation, and that can lead to other issues like alcohol and drugs, or suicide, or other issues. But I think that one of the things that we also really want to identify from this is when hate crime is targeted at an individual player, this isn't just the individual that is experiencing hate crime. There will be other people associated with that individual who are affected. Often they might have family members who run their social media accounts, so their family members might be seeing and monitoring the abuse, and therefore not knowing also what to do, and not having the resources or the tools to do this. The family members themselves will potentially see the impact of the hate crime or the hates that they've seen, so they might feel very moody or depressed or sad when they get home, which then has an impact on family. But equally, knowing the family might feel that their individual is targeted, they might be impacted. But equally, there's also the broader sense that other members of that community, so if someone is experiencing racist abuse, other people who are part of that racialized group, or maybe even other ethnicities and racialized groups within that, might feel more vulnerable. So you have, it's not just the individual that is targeted, but it has quite a bit broad social issue. And one of the things we sort of want to talk about as well, and just sort of highlight, is that, and this sort of goes with a lot of crime, and it sort of challenges a lot of the crime narrative. Particularly in the UK, the idea is that crime is done by these criminals who are, a different breed, and they're malicious, and they're actively looking to sort of take what's not theirs. And when it comes to hate crime, and this is actually what makes hate crime quite difficult to tackle, is that actually a lot of people might have actually engaged in something that could be seen as hate crime. So they might have made a racist comment or a sexist comment, which makes the other person feel, vulnerable or marginalized, or extends that feeling of isolation away. And it's not necessarily that, particularly around things like racism, that it's these far-right people who are out there to go and stop people from coming into our country. It is actually quite commonplace, the views that might be being expressed. It's not that therefore it's this extreme individual over here is actually quite a normal, everyday type of person, which then obviously makes it quite difficult to police or to tackle, because for a lot of people, they might not feel that they are a criminal, or that they fit into the image of what a criminal is supposed to look like. And therefore this actually makes it very hard for people to say, well, actually, no, I'm not a criminal, therefore I didn't do it, as opposed to what I did actually is a crime, and therefore maybe I should be doing something about it. And just sort of bring in some more other sort of definitions and the offending aspects of it, the impact on people, is that a lot of it is about these feelings of shame and disgust. And again, this is what contributes to those psychological issues around individuals who maybe lose confidence, which then obviously, when we think about from a football perspective, maybe have an impact on their performances on the pitch, and then that can spiral into other issues. There is a gender aspect to this, particularly around men. They might feel that they lose power, and therefore that can also have a stigmatizing effect, particularly when it's around violence, physical violence. But I think the psychological aspect is also very, very important. One of the things we've got to think about, and this is hate crime in general, but also about online, is why do people do this? So why are people sending this abuse? And part of this is about, remember, these are some of the things that Walters has sort of identified as why these might be feeling, what this abuse might be, could be symbolic of something that's much broader in their own particular lives. So broader social issues, maybe community issues, maybe their own feelings of insecurity, or even perceptions about how they feel about how different groups might be seen, and particularly from a political point of view, how the media and politicians might stoke up divisions between certain social groups, which then can manifest itself in action on the ground. And there's also, this maybe feeling of lack of, self-control. We've got to also be slightly mindful that we don't want to just go into an individualistic approach here, which is that it's just an individual who doesn't have control. But there is some aspect where there is some agency here, and the individual does make a choice to send something abusive or to act in a violent way. And here's some of the sort of charts in the UK, for example, specifically around football. And what we can see is arrests. And again, this is always slightly complicated, is how many police are actually arresting people, whether they're reporting them as arrests. But this is just about indecent chanting. And we have started to see an increase. And of course, there is a big gap there around COVID. So there was no games taking place, so we don't see anything happening. And this is much more clear here. So this is more about not just about chanting, but actually about reported incidents. But again, it's reporting. It's who's actually reporting them, and whether they're being recorded by the police in particular. But we can clearly see that there was a COVID year where there was very little to no matches in England, that the matches were played behind closed doors. But we can also see that there is a general increase on particularly around sexuality and race and gender identity as well. But there is still an increase. Now, again, does this mean it's definitely increasing, or does it mean that the police are actually better at reporting it? We have to sort of drill down, and this particular project isn't doing that. But I think we just should be mindful of some of those particular figures. And before I get into sort of the broader project, football, and this is one of the things I want to argue, is that football is often seen as a problem, and the media often like to portray particularly fans as being problematic, particularly if they're violent. But often they will criticize players as well for not being, good human beings or role models. But actually, football has been one of those spaces where a lot of activity has taken place to challenge some of these things. There's been lots of campaigns in Europe and in the UK in particular to try to change other fans' behaviours, or to push for the law to change, or for the governing bodies or the clubs to do more. So there's been lots of particularly anti-racism campaigns, but anti-homophobia campaigns as well. There's other campaigns around inclusion for people of different faiths, around different genders in particular as well, particularly around female fans being accepted in the game. Often these are fan-led, so they're coming from within the fan base and saying, look, we have a right to be here as well, and we are fans just like you. And in some cases, I think that's very, very beneficial, because one of the things about football fans is that it's a good way of understanding how groups form, who we are, who you are, how we act, how you act, even to what colours we wear, or how we identify, and how we act. And often, if the criticism is coming from outside the fan base, often from someone like UEFA or the FA, then fans might feel that it's coming from outside and it's about challenging us. Whereas actually, if it's coming from within the fan base or from the club, then there's actually more chance that positive change will happen. And the football industry has slowly taken more interest. There's a quote from Les Back and John Solomos, who wrote an excellent book about racism in English football 20 years ago. They sort of highlighted how the first response to anti-racism initiatives was always, it's not a problem. It's not a problem here. It's not a problem in our club. Whereas now they're starting to recognise, particularly around race and racism, to the point where the Premier League and the England national team were taking the knee to highlight racism in football and outside. But they're not so quick on maybe some other issues, particularly around sexism. But we are starting to see some changes. But also part of the issue is also football in the UK has a specific legal is treated differently under the law. So the sale of alcohol at football matches is banned, but it is not banned at rugby matches or cricket matches or other sporting events. And therefore there is particular legislation, laws, that if something happens at a football match, the perpetrator is more likely to be treated harsher than if they were at another football event, another sport event, or another social event, even at the same location. So you could have a music concert at a football stadium, and you could be drunk on violence at a music venue, and but if you were drunk and violent at a football match at the same venue, you would be treated harsher by the authorities because of the specific laws. But equally, it's hard to remove that law because it's quite a symbolic law, and it suggests that the Law Commission has suggested that maybe they shouldn't repeal it because it actually might sort of indicate that actually the issues aren't there, whereas the issues still aren't there. So I'll move on to sort of the more key parts about the project about online hate. There's a specific context within the UK as well, and again, it's a legal context. At the moment, there is a government piece of legislation called the Online Safety Bill that is going through Parliament. So potentially there is a new law that will come in that will specifically introduce a law to tackle online hate, so that if people are victims, they have some recourse through the legal process. But equally, if your people are abusers online, then they have, they might be more. There will be clearer legislation about what laws they have actually broken. They talk a bit specifically about that social media companies must address harm. Now, this may be changed in the last week. We're having some mixed signals coming from government. They don't actually specify what harm is. And there is a suggestion that the government might take this out, which means that it completely waters down the actual the legislation, because then it's less about the impact on the victim and more about just identifying certain behaviours in the perpetrators. Whereas when it's about harm, then it focuses on the victims. And actually, I would argue that that is actually a much better way of dealing with some of these issues. And partly it's also about fighting anonymity. So the government in particular have highlighted how, what their argument is that they think a lot of abuse is coming from online accounts that are anonymous. Some of those will be bots, and maybe automated bots, or maybe human bots who are just sending abuse. But then equally, there is also an argument that anonymity exists online because some groups can't express who they are safely online. So if you're from a particular marginalized group, let's give an example of somewhere like Iran at the moment, there's protests there, or in China, there's protests there, that they might not be able to put all they might not want to put in all their details so they could be identified by the states, by the authorities. There's also, and I would make this argument very clearly, is that a lot of the hates that comes online in the UK is actually coming from politicians and journalists. And actually, we know who they are. They're not anonymous. They're quite clearly targeted at particular groups and individuals. So I think making it only coming from it, suggesting that abuse only comes from anonymous accounts misses all the abuse that comes from often people with certain power within the government and journalists. And one of the things, the other issues is around online hate is about social media companies themselves. They don't see themselves as publishers. You know, if a journalist published something in a newspaper, the newspaper is publishing that, and therefore the publishing company, the publisher, the newspaper, is liable for what criminal act is taking place. Social media companies argue that they are just hosts. You know, they're not publishers. They are just basically, they're providing a space where people then post various things. And they also don't see that, you know, there's minimal compliance here. They don't tackle the issues as quickly or as effectively as they should. And let's be honest, there is an argument, which is one of the things we would like to look at from this particular project, which is around that the social media companies are profiting from hate. It generates people, it generates usage, it generates content, it generates people coming on, people getting angry. Facebook in particular has taken money from advertisers who are actively promoting hate and misinformation and dividing people. So yeah, there is an advertising revenue from hate, but equally, the more people get angry online, the more that they are using those pieces of software and those platforms. So let's sort of put this into a football context. This is a report that came out early this year actually, about abuse online. A lot of this was automated, so AI, and looking at how they identified certain characteristics. They did a sample of 3,000 tweets towards players, and they identified, you know, broad sort of thing. You know, some of these 55% were positive, and 3.5% were abusive. Now, of the 2.3 of even within that, there's still quite a high number. And you know, they looked at another 2.3 million tweets, of which they said 22.6 contains abuse. But that was 59, nearly 60,000 pieces of abuse directed at players. So that's still a significant amount of abuse. Even if it's a low percentage, it's still a high number. Identity attacks were actually quite low. So there's part of football which is to be abusive to opposition players, to referees, etc. And what they found, that was actually a very, very small amount. 0.2% of all tweets was actually about a player's identity, i.e. their race or religion. But that still came to over 5,000 tweets. That's still quite a lot. And you know, one person receiving that, you know, well, just one piece of abuse is too much. What was also interesting, and I think the next slide shows it, is that actually certain players receive more abuse. The majority of players have received abuse online. Nearly 70% have received at least one abusive tweet. 1 in 14 players receive it every day. So again, it's a process. They may come in from different people from different places, but it's still an impact on them and will still have an impact on them. And I think this is something that we're starting to find in our own project, is that abuse varies over time. And there's key moments. You know, missing penalties in a European Championship final is one of them, but there's also particular events online, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. And this is sort of their stats, and we can sort of see how there's certain peaks. The start of the season is a really interesting one there. So obviously people have a bit of, you know, downtime over the summer, and then suddenly September, new players, maybe the teams aren't playing as well as they could be. Not quite sure what that particular one in November is from last year. But you can see, and of course what it will be is correlated around particular games, particular incidents online, and also who is targeted for abuse. What we can see here is that there is actually a slow, and there's something like about 10 players receive most of the abuse. One of those being Cristiano Ronaldo, Harry Maguire is another one. Here it is, yeah. So this is 50% of all abuse. 2% of the players received most of the abuse. So it's very much targeted. But again, we don't want to just say, oh, it's just targeted at certain individuals when 70% of players have actually received abuse. Now, what I'm going to talk about, I'm aware of time, is a bit of the background about what we've done over the last year to effectively highlight the academic gaps in the literature and what needs to be done and what some of the things that we're going to look at, but also open this up for other people to look at as a potential issue. And the data's out there, and we can provide some of it if people want to look at things. But it's partly about identifying for ourselves what we should be looking at as part of this project, because we have got a lot of Twitter data around different European championships, men and women's European championships in Europe. But we also have, and there's so much data, I've never experienced anything like this. There's so much data. We need some direction on what we should be looking for within that data. So what we did is this scoping review. What we did was, it had to be peer reviewed. And this is a big criticism, I think, of ourselves, is it's written or available in English. So that means there's a massive gap there for non-English academic articles and chapters. And obviously there's sizable parts of the globe where articles will be written in Spanish or Portuguese, or maybe others that we haven't included in this. And it's primarily concerned with online hate and sport. So there are certain things where there might be something around online activity, but we haven't included it because it's not actually about hate. It's just about online activity and sport. And there might be some others that's about online hate, but it's not including sport at all. So what we did is we put certain terms into Scopus, which is a research database to identify a lot of different issues. And obviously we used various terms. Some of them we had to exclude. For example, we could put in about sport and abuse, or online abuse, or abuse. But in English, abuse can mean sort of verbal abuse directed towards someone, but it can also be about physical abuse, and that could be sexual abuse. And therefore, we had to exclude articles around sexual abuse and sport, for example, because it's not about online hate. But equally also about like doping and issues like that might also fall into the same issues. So what we started to find is and this is very much a review of academic articles. We actually found, I think it was about 43 articles. So there's not many in the last 17 years. So the first article was 2005, which indicates that social media is a new thing. There wasn't obviously articles about Twitter and social media in the 1990s because it just didn't exist. But what we tended to find as well is that certain platforms were focused, Twitter being the common one. If I'm slightly critical of academics, and myself is included in this because I've done this as an article myself, is Twitter's data is slightly easier to access. So therefore, as an academic, it's quite good to do a very quick, not a quick article, but an article on one particular issue based on Twitter data. So as academics, maybe we're going for quick wins as opposed to maybe something more in depth. And this sort of comes out in the lower part here. About says most of these are about secondary data. So we're using Twitter data as the evidence, as the data that we use for our analysis, as opposed to going off and doing some primary data. So only 6 actually did that. And by primary data, I mean maybe looking, doing some interviews with people, potentially victims, particularly with people around the social media companies or with other organizations. And one of the gaps that we definitely found was that so much of what the analysis is the content of what was said and maybe the implications of it, but very rarely does the academic analysis go and speak to the victims themselves. or potentially find out what the impact of the online hate was actually for them. So it's very much a sort of a low-level analysis of what was, content analysis of what was said, as opposed to a discourse analysis of how that might have been sort of received under the level. Unsurprisingly, for a review that was primarily focused at England, the majority are coming from the USA and the UK. So we are getting obviously some other English speakers and some other international ones. And I mean by this, this is about the focus of where the research was. So it's not necessarily the location of the author or the researcher, but actually what the focus was. So for example, one of mine is in here because it was on Italy, but it was written in English, so it comes under there. And unsurprisingly, based on this sort of characteristics, football is the primary one, but also because of the US perspective, American football and basketball have also sort of been quite high, but also Aussie rules football, Australian rules football for Australia as well. So what we can start to see is there's certain similarities sort of coming out. We're not looking, this isn't specifically around hate crime or hate, but it is about abuse, and it's about racism, it's about sexism, it's about homophobia online, but it is very much around directed at people and discussed about it being online and directed around sport specifically. And again, much of the focus is around athletes. So the recipient tends to be an athlete or player, and that seems to be the focus of a lot of these. And again, speaking as critiquing academia is often weakened. And I'm putting myself in this. The article I referred to was about racism in Italy, but directed at one player, Mario Balotelli. It's often quite easy to do an article about the impact on one particular player or one individual, and then doing a Twitter, getting the Twitter data for that, and then doing an analysis. And what we start to see as well is, there's certain other groups that aren't being discussed here. So, journalists, there's a few about it, but not many. But obviously not directed at referees, for example, or other people within the game, or even directed at people like, the FIFA president or heads of football associations. And often it's seen as that fans are the perpetrators. So again, a lot of it's about looking at fandom, but actually we're not looking at some of the broader issues here. And again, looking at the type of hate that's here, the majority around racism, but some around misogyny and homophobia. But there's others that are sort of missing there. And there's certain ones, there's one on anti-Semitism, one on two on Islamophobia. So there's not much written about this, these issues online within the English-speaking world. So I'm just aware of time. So that's very much given us a sort of foundation for what we're looking at, and opened up a lot of our avenues, because we've identified so many gaps here. There's obviously gaps around geography, around particular types of sport. We're not filling that gap on sport because this is a project specifically around football, and football is the most commonly used sport to analyze online hate, but we're going to add to that. We do want to bring in the victims and other people, so we want to bring in some qualitative data to some primary data to think about this. And what we started to identify is certain key areas that I think we really want to focus on, and we're sort of working through these. So I'm really sorry that I haven't got a more, one of these that I could talk about, but this is very much giving us a background and give us some indications. But also it'd be really interesting to see how people, say in Brazil, where you're from, how you might see these type of issues online, and other areas that might need to be obviously researched, because this is such a big issue and a big area with so much data that there's opportunities for lots of different people here. One of the things, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the things that's coming through the interviews is that despite the academic research focusing on the tweets directed at an individual, an athlete or a player, what's missing from that is that it's not just the player that's affected. There's other viewers, so other people who will see that tweet who will be affected. Their family and friends, as I said earlier, because the player will be affected, so they will have to then be, picking them up, or maybe, seeing their moods or how it's affecting them. But also the moderators as well. I think we can split this into a couple of, like two sort of parts here. One is often the players might employ they're wealthy young men. They are often you bringing in their family and friends to do some of the to spread their money around, and they'll to trusted people as well. And sometimes it's family members who might do the moderation, so they will be seeing some of this abuse and knowing, and maybe stopping it from getting to the player, but they're still being affected. But equally, there is also a professionalization of moderation. So some of this will be coming from professionalization within the social media companies, professionalization within the police forces. So you will have particular individuals whose job it is to moderate and look at this abuse. And that has a psychological and emotional impact on those individuals who will also be affected by this, particularly if you just keep seeing the same thing over and over again. And equally as us as academics researching this, it's not pleasant to be seeing some of the things that are said. So there's a duty of care and potentially an area of protection for those who are moderating and seeing this type of abuse. Often, particularly with the academic literature, is a lot of the focus is about the social media space, the online space. But what is becoming clear, and I think this is why football is a good space to understand this, is that these activities don't just occur online. Some of these individuals who will be posting racism online, for example, will also be saying something racist at a football stadium, potentially shouting abuse at a player, and maybe they know they shouldn't say, you black bastard at a player, so they might just go, you bastard. So they might just be swearing and abusive there, but then maybe online they do let the racialized aspect get in. But these two things are not discrete. They're occurring, the abuse is happening offline and online as well. And the prejudicial views that they hold, which come out online, are also going to be prejudicial views they hold in everyday life. This is not something that is unique to football. This is something that is happening in society. Another thing that we've really sort of identified as well is that there's an anti-hate industry. So on one hand, the social media companies themselves are profiting from hate, and there's a whole part of analysis there that I think we would like to do. But there's also an industry that's forming, particularly of tech companies who are trying to program and preempt and spot hate towards players and then sell that product to the players or to the clubs. So that they then, there's an industry now about, tech companies selling a product that is effectively there to mask or hide the issue from the players, as opposed to actually tackling the issue, i.e. stopping it from happening in the first place. But they can profit from the fact that they can then sell a product that just sort of hides it. And another issue that's definitely come out is about ownership. One thing about football is there's lots of stakeholders. There are clubs, there are governing bodies, there are leagues, there are different levels of governing body, there are clubs, there are fans, there are fan groups, there are localized fan groups, national fan groups. And there's also other organizations trying to fight against racism, for example, or hate. And also there's social media companies. And no one, with the exception of some players, some fan groups, and some of the campaigns, is really owning it what we're sort of finding is that the players will say, well, the league, the FA needs to do something, or the Premier League needs to do something. The clubs will say that it's the social media companies that need to do it. The FA will say the social media companies. The social media companies will go, no, it's not our job. It's the government. It's not, well, the government should do something. The government said, well, the social media companies should do something. No one is actually owning the issue and really identifying what the issue is and how that needs to be tackled. So what we're going to have is, again, a perpetuation of this. And the current things that we're currently working on and where we want to go forward with this, and I'll sort of finish up with these so we can have some questions. It's something that I sort of started with at the beginning, which was when players were taking the knee, and this is a project that some part of the project that I'm working on at the moment, which is about how the wider political discourse that is coming from, we can see it coming from the US in particular, but also certain terms that are used to describe the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, or just people who are trying to tackle racism or other issues in general, how that is seeping into the football discourse. In particular, in Britain, there's a particular term called woke, which has come from African Americans about being awake to racial injustice. And invariably, no one who is an anti-racist campaigner would use the word woke. But what now has become is particularly, I've got this sort of headline from a newspaper in the UK, a very prominent one, which sort of publishes articles about anti-woke things all the time. That headline, again, woke blob tries to ban, apparently the left wing are trying to ban Christmas, a news story that comes up every year, but Christmas is still here and it still exists. But even things like the blob is there, apparently is a term used to describe this group of people that work in London that are trying to stop, to make Britain more liberal and left wing. But we can also see in some of the tweets that came through, particularly around taking the knee, about this, about these terms of woke, that this is about Marxism. So, so in America, Black Lives Matter movement was called Marxist, and now somehow that means that those players who are taking the knee are now Marxist. But even things about being anti-white, that this is about challenging, stopping white people. And interestingly as well is also how some of the discourse about sport and politics shouldn't exist, and a lot of these people saying that these players are making football political. I'm talking to sports academics. We all know that sport is political. The fact that a country is hosting a World Cup is political. Qatar has put itself on the map. It's nation building. Brazil hosted the World Cup and the Olympics. Russia has done the same. London 2012 for the Olympic Games in England was about showcasing England to the world, again, to remind people that England is still here, and that the new, as with Japan, with Tokyo rather, and with Paris. So even at that level, but equally we know that when a player is being subjected to racist or sexist abuse, that is also political, and therefore, just resisting that is political too. We've got data from both men and women's tournaments, so we need to do some comparative analysis, and we're very aware that most of our analysis so far has been on men's tournaments, partly because they have been more media driven, so they're more prominent, more people are more aware of some of the issues that have come out in the men's game. But we need to be aware of what's happening in the women's game, and recognizing as well that obviously that's slightly different. Whereas a black male player might be targeted because of his black skin, in the women's game it might be because of their gender and then their race, and we want to do some of that analysis as well. And also what we want to do, and part of the reason for the interviews and doing semi-structured interviews, is to come up with some resources some educational material, so we can work with players, with other organisation, to try to identify best practice about how to deal with this, both from an emotional perspective, but also from just a technological one about how to stop it. And part of this is also maybe identifying some strategies that take place because online, because what we've noticed and what I think a common perception about online discourse is how it very much spirals away from each other, and that it basically entrenches two views. And actually what we want to try and do is identify some conversations, some interactions where maybe someone was approached about a particular abusive term they used, someone tackled it or addressed it, and saw the person then go, oh, I'm sorry, or reflect on it. And we'd like to try and identify some strategies about maybe how to get people to reflect on what they're doing, as opposed to going, that's racist, and then someone just going, well, no, it's not, and then it just becomes two camps. And the big challenge is going to be how to get social media companies to take ownership. I think with the current owner of Twitter, that's unlikely to happen anytime soon, particularly as we see more people who have been banned for hate being welcomed back onto the platform. But equally, we would like to try and get some sort of data that even if we work with our stakeholders and our partners, we can provide the evidence to the Premier League or to the clubs or to campaigning organisations that we can put a lot of pressure on to stop this from happening. But we recognise that it's also quite difficult. So I'll finish up there. So thank you very much for listening. Hopefully I did it at the right tempo and the right level. More than happy to answer some questions. But if you are interested in this particular project, we do have some other information here. But I will stop sharing and then open it up to questions if that's okay. Over to you, Marcio.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mark. It's a brilliant project. I really enjoy your presentation. I guess there's a lot of questions and things to think about. If anyone has any question, please, you can open your webcam and ask Mark directly, or you can write in the chat, even in Portuguese. I translate for Mark, no, it's not a problem. I know that Leandro has a question already. I don't know if you want to do it right now, Leandro, or maybe not. All right. But I guess I have some questions for you, Mark. I don't know if Rolando wants to talk about something also right now, but
go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I was thinking more from a perspective of sports journalism. Like, I'm a journalist, and we have a lot of journalists here in the audience. So we know that sports journalism is prone to do a lot of stereotypes, like racial bias and gender bias, and it's maybe easy to do something like that. I know even here in Brazil, we're always listening to every World Cup about how African countries and African teams is more athletic than the white teams and how the white nations is more intellectual, something like that. So it's easy to do. We tend to think about sports from this perspective. I remember now an interesting research on Football Manager, the game, and how the black players, even in the game, tend to actually act more violent and behavior badly. I believe this was a research. So what do you think about what is the role of sports journalism in tackling hate speech?
That's a really good question. And interestingly, we have actually been able to speak with quite a lot of sport journalists as part of this project. Partly because I think some of them recognise, there might be a story in this and this is something to follow. But I think it's also partly that they are also victims of hate. And that they do receive abuse. And I mean, one of the sort of interesting narratives that I have heard sport journalists talk about and sort of make jokes about is how that every journalist has a particular club that they don't ever talk about. And so there's always an anti-Liverpool bias, or an anti-Manchester United bias, or an anti-Arsenal bias, or an anti-Chelsea bias. It's like, really? I think it sort of indicates how certain, and I think this is something that I think there's a good piece of research to be done here about how sensitive football fans are to criticism, and also how, or omission as well. So if you're not talked about, why aren't we being talked about? And it's like, well, okay. So sport journalists have been, involved and, are victims of abuse, but equally there's also a recognition that they can perpetuate some of these. And I must admit, some of the sport journalists we've spoken with have been more of the, how should I say it, more of the, maybe more academic journalists who are writing stories about sport, about football, and maybe write about the issues that we might write about, as I might write about as a sociologist, or we might write about as academics, as opposed to the more match reporter type of journalist. We haven't managed. That's a good admission. That's a good point that sort of makes us think maybe we need to speak to some of those. I know from some of the research in the UK, I mean, there's a colleague, a friend of mine at Leicester, Paul Campbell, who wrote something around like the terminology used in journalistic or commentators' descriptions, and like black players were like athletic. I think it was like the title was like he runs like a gazelle, and there has been some reflection in the UK. So there was a podcast I listened to about a year ago where the journalists actually did think about this, and there has been some work to sort of address this, particularly in the commentators, where, again, always describing black players as athletic or strong or fast or quick, whereas white players as intelligent, strategic. And I have actually, I know it's very much an anecdote, but I have noticed commentators changing their language differently. So I don't know if this is conscious or if this is something that is being trained about, for example, very consciously calling black players intelligent, or using different language and trying to challenge some of those stereotypes. So I think sport journalists do have a role in that, part of how they communicate to a big audience and can perpetuate some of the stereotypes that the fans and other people might pick up on. But it's equally also recognizing that this isn't just an issue that is just journalists, because they are also the victims of abuse in these situations. And if they write a critical piece about a player or about a club, then they will get that abuse, particularly. And one of the things, again, we've noticed is that, some of that will draw in those protected characteristics. For example, a female journalist will get more abuse than male journalists. And when they do get abuse, it will be linked to their gender. So it will be about going back to the kitchen, or you shouldn't be a football fan, and things like that. So it's those same, and I think this is maybe the thing, is those same stereotypes are also leveled at journalists. And if journalists don't like the stereotypes being associated with them, then there's also being mindful of what that might do when they talk about players and teams.
Yeah, of course. Rolando, please. Está sem áudio.
Just a minute. Yeah, I have something to illustrate that about the races. When I play basketball, I played in the States, like in the 80s, and I played at university, and we had only 2 white players and 10 black players. And we did fine. We hang out together. We didn't have any problems. But was in Texas, right? You know how Texans are.
Yeah.
So one day, the head coach called me at the office, and me and the other white player, and said, "Yeah, you have to take charge of the team because you're the one that do the right plays. You can think, you're smart." And I said, "Okay." I left, and then the other day he called some black players to the office and said, "We have only those 2 because the society demands that we have some white players on the team. They don't matter. You are, and sometimes those things happen inside the team." He didn't know that we talk. We were friends, and very unusual, right? Never had something like that happen to me before, And I had a lot of abuse because of my height. I was very tall, and we didn't have social media. Yeah. But if we had at that time, I think I would be very abused. And I had a lot of problems with that during my life, my youth. And something that made me very curious, 2 things. One, I was going to ask about the female sports, but you talk about already. And I was very surprised that it happens on the esports too. Do you have an example or something like that so you can share with us?
That's a really good point. There's a big gap that we haven't looked at is esports. And if I'm honest, it's my own, I don't know enough about esports, but, and I don't have an example, I'm afraid, but I do know it's become someone contacted me about doing a PhD and about this type of issue. And it was like, okay. And I realized that there is a whole world of esports that is, I did a lecture to my students, I think a month ago, about corruption. And I always start it by looking for some news stories. And one of the first news stories that came up was about corruption and match fixing in esports. And I'm like, wow, right, okay, there's a whole world here that I don't know about. But yeah, I think there's, and that's something potentially we need to think about for this project is speaking to those people, the players of esports as well, because there's a whole world there that I just don't know about. But I think it's being replicated in esports, and what we're seeing in sport is also happening in esports.
Esports is growing. They have professional teams and everything. Yeah. They have matches on TV now here in Brazil. Yeah. I don't know if over there too. They have matches on the cable TV, on Sport TV. That's or cable sports network here. So it's a new thing to look at. The world is changing, and that's the way. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I actually curious about something, but I'll read the 2 messages we have here. Marcelo told you about this conflict between education and accountability cannot continue. Ideally, companies should punish users who use such hate speech on their platform instead of expecting these users to stop being rude. Oh, I believe we all agree with that. And Anderson also told you about, he says, just a suggestion to get to know the material produced in Brazil, the work that the Observatory of Racial Discrimination Football has been publishing. annual reports, website, and now a podcast, and also partnership with CBF. And he sends you the link Observatório Racial. I will send you later by email. I believe it's maybe something you may have interest. But I'm gonna ask you about why some players are more targeted than others. Why Cristiano Ronaldo? I believe there is something about how some players get a kind of totemic aspect, like a symbolic aspect of symbolize or signifying something for the audience. Why Cristiano Ronaldo? I believe it's because some of that. But Mario Balotelli, it's kind of obvious, like a Black Italian, how this immigration, the changes in the last 20, 30 years for Italian society. But why do you believe some players get more targeted than others?
That's a good question. I mean, thanks, Anderson, for that link as well. That's really interesting, and I'd like to have a look later. Yeah. Why certain players? I think it's the same. It's the same dynamics about what creates a celebrity and a star player. And I think in terms of how I might think about this, I'm thinking about how, again, and this is why I think football is a good way of understanding how we groups form, but also how those groups like to see themselves. I'm thinking of there was a piece of work, again, Les Back and John Solomos wrote about racism in football, but there's also Gary Robson wrote something about Millwall, which is a particular football team that has a sort of association with violent, hooliganism and racism. Yeah. And they talk in their works about how certain players come to symbolize how the fans themselves feel about themselves. So, for example, Millwall, which is in southeast London, which is working class, hardworking, industrial. They liked players who were hardworking, industrial, ran around a lot, as opposed to the type of player who may be skillful and would maybe not very strong, possibly, but very skillful, and they wouldn't like that type of player. Sometimes this gets wrapped up in race. So it's about how that team might see themselves as being, so for example, a player who is foreign, who's not British, might be seen as being more flamboyant or more skillful and therefore not as physically tough or strong. But then equally, certain groups then get accepted if particularly Afro-Caribbeans in the UK are now seen as strong and tough. The stereotypes you said about earlier, Marcia, is, well, they're now accepted in our group because they're strong and tough, and we like strong and tough people as opposed to skillful people. Whereas different clubs maybe have slightly different views. West Ham has a certain view that they like to play passing football, and this is partly about how fan groups create the narratives about themselves and sustain those narratives, which is, we are a physically strong team, or we are we like to play passing football and we like to pass the team around. So on one hand, these players, this how these become star players, and I would also say is wrapped up in masculinity as well. What it's like to be a man is, so you're either a winner or you're tough or something like that, or a team player, that might be a way of seeing it. A leader or a captain. So how these players are elevated in terms of who we are is equally then who we're not. So the type of players who we are not. So again, as you mentioned, Mario Balotelli, how those Italians might see themselves, and I found it quite ironic reading some of the quotes in that particular research, is that they were saying that he was too individualistic, too emotional, you know, he wasn't a team player in the sense. I can't remember some of the other things, but equally, those are the stereotypes that many British people might hold about Italians in general. And the way that the Italians were describing Mario Balotelli was how British people might describe Italians.
Yeah.
And it was very ironic, I thought, was quite sad. But again, it's how they wanted to be seen. Yeah, he didn't work hard, he was lazy. And it's like, oh yeah, British people say that about Italians. It's like, yeah, even though I know it's not true. And I know, these stereotypes. So I think on one hand, fan groups raise certain individuals to be, this is who we are, but equally, that type of player is someone we're not. So, for example, a Ronaldo might be seen as someone who is vain or is all about his image, or particular maybe skill, that certain type of skill. In England, he will be known for falling over, for diving. Right. So therefore, that's seen as not British. So therefore, he will be attracted there. Ronaldo, I think, is a very particular case. So for the same reason that certain players become celebrities, and equally why he has become a celebrity, is also the same reasons why he will be the target for abuse. One of the other players was Harry Maguire, who has played for England, but also plays for Manchester United. Yeah. And for some reason, he has a lot of abuse. Now, some of it is he hasn't played very well, particularly this season. But there's lots of story. I'm not any. I don't follow the England team, and I don't follow Manchester United. But he always seems to try his best. He always gives 100%. But sometimes he makes mistakes because of it, and therefore people pick up on those mistakes. So potentially it's about how they see themselves, and then they symbolize that in a player, and then those players who don't symbolize that are then the ones who are abused. And that might be about race, it might be about ability, it might be about work rate or technical ability and things like that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we have this complicated relation with Neymar in Brazil. Although he is, of course, the best player of our nation, he is not very well liked. I believe it's kind of a thing to hate Neymar. Like he's not a good. He is a good player, but he's not a good character. Like he supports Bolsonaro, and he is always playing, and he doesn't play like 100%. Maybe there's this idea in Brazil, and there's always have been this idea in Brazil about Neymar. I believe since he started in Santos, there is this idea that he is not a very compromised player. Like even how media talks about Neymar, it's always it's around 30 years, 31, and he's still a boy, the boy Neymar we call here, and it's a very strange relation on Neymar. Okay, but Leandro is talking about this is a classic case of hate, but I believe he wants to say something. Leandro, please ask Mark.
Oh, yes, teacher. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Mark, for your presentation. Very interesting. Actually, today we have this free access to the social medias and this kind of a freedom that we can say everything and we can give our opinion without being like censored or something like that. So, do you believe that this kind of access and this kind of freedom in the social media is motivating more people like practicing their hate, because it's like the hate was there in the past, but no, we don't have this kind of connections and views. But today we have this easily. Do you think this the internet and the security of being behind a screen motivated people to practicing their hate in the sports especially for football?
I mean, I think hating football has always been there, and it, particularly in England, and I know in Italy as well, is that fans will be very abusive towards players.
Yeah.
And they will shout some very nasty things. And when I was younger, I probably did the same thing too. And in certain times as well, it has been wrapped up with racism and homophobia. But equally, referees will get a lot of abuse. There's lots of songs about referees, directed at referees. In the UK and in Italy, so it's offline anyway. There is also a big argument about what's happening online, and I think what I would argue the issue with online is not necessarily anonymity, because again, I think there's a certain name that's come up, and I don't want to be political, and I don't know enough about Brazil, but a president of Brazil will have said things. We had a prime minister in the UK who has been openly racist, and we have other politicians who are openly racist and exclusionary and using very similar tactics. So we know who they are, and they're not being anonymous.
Yeah.
And we have it from journalists as well and other things. So I think what that does, and I think what part of this is about breaking down the social boundaries, where those feelings of shame that we might have, or maybe even the collective act of going, this isn't right. And we might get that at football, to go, actually, this isn't right. Why, or that this is acceptable. Hooliganism acceptable, we'll do this. But there might be others going, hey, whoa, and then that conversation takes place face to face, and it may be at football or at bars or something afterwards. What's happening online is that you're not necessarily hearing the dissenting voices. You're only seeing or finding the people that agree with you, and therefore there's a certain sense that, oh yeah, this is okay, this is okay, this is okay. And we're not hearing that voice, all those other voices said, this isn't acceptable. And sometimes social media can be good for that. Message boards I've been part of message boards where, we have these conversations take place as football fans about what is acceptable behavior and what isn't. And, it could be just about swearing at a football match, as opposed to anything abusive. But then, on certain social media platforms, Facebook and in Twitter in particular, you can find the people who think like you. And that basically reaffirms that what you're feeling is right. And often then that's being reaffirmed by politicians and journalists who are saying, yeah, that's right, you should be hateful. These foreigners are taking your jobs. Yeah. And, you should be scared of non-white people, which is happening in the UK right now. So, and then those voices are sort of coalescing together, and we're not hearing the alternative voices, which maybe, and this is potentially where football is a good space. And this is, I think, what was quite interesting. The image I showed at the start with the people taking the knee is that the England players before the European Championships took the knee to protest against racism.
Yeah.
And then some football fans at the stadiums booed the players. And what we had is quite a strange situation in the UK where the back pages, which are the sport pages, those journalists were criticising the fans and supporting the players. The front of the newspapers were the political journalists were criticising the players for being political and supporting the fans' right to boo. And then we also had politicians do that. So what is happening is that the politicians and the journalists are sort of supporting the groups that are doing one thing, and maybe the sport journalists are actually the ones, but we're having the conversation in sport and in football about this. Is this acceptable, isn't it? And it at least gives us that space, an opportunity to do that, which I don't think we're getting outside of football, Leandro. I don't know if you find this in Brazil, but Britain is very divided because of Brexit in particular, so leaving the European Union. and it's really divided. And the politicians have particularly said, right, we're going to support the people that voted to leave, despite all the chaos that's happening. And it's just divided the country. So it's, we're just seeing that. And then, of course, what's happening online then is those people are forming in camps and speaking to each other and reaffirming their views, regardless of what side they're on. And we're not having that discussion, that national discussion about what Britain is anymore, what England is, what our future is. It's just the other people are the problem. And that's really divisive and it's really problematic. So, yeah, so in answer to your question, Leandro, it's partly about what's happening offline, but it also does help people find their similar views, which then keeps them separate and polarized.
Yeah, it's interesting because yesterday I was talking to a friend. He works in Google, and he said, "Hey, we are facing the most inclusive generation," and he said, "Yeah, but why? Why we have this chaos if everyone is so inclusive? Is everyone talking about love and doing everything for love and respect? Why we have all this highest so terrible abusive speeches in the online?" So he said, "Hey, it's like we are talking about love, but we are creating a war to defend the love." So it's a kind of complicated. And I said, yes, it's difficult to understand this, especially for football.
I think that's what's happening in Europe, I see, and also in America, is that's the fear, is that there's a generation, the young are the inclusive and welcoming and tolerant group of people. And for some people, that's not acceptable. And they tend to be the older people in Britain. But they also vote in Britain. And therefore the politicians are going, right, we'll work with those people who are older, but are less tolerant. And therefore it's creating a discourse which is really, really negative. And I hope that, young people continue to recognize this and go, yeah, let's keep being inclusive.
Yeah. But thinking about what Leandro was saying, what you told Mark, there is this phenomenon of outsourcing their hate, something like that. Like we have a president that is very sexist and racist and a lot of things, and people kind of they see themselves like authorized by these ideas from the president to be hateful, and we've seen a lot of that lately. There is this. What do you think about this atmosphere that is created? How this kind of go on to the game? I remember something very interesting that happened in the last year in the Euro. When the Brazilians right wing, the Brazilians from the right wing, the Bolsonaro supporters, they started to cheer for Hungary at the Euro, because in Hungary there was no, the stadium was full because there is no COVID, and Bolsonaro was like, there is no COVID, it's only a flu, and everybody should be outside. And I believe this is very strange, like how Brazilians tend to support Hungary, not because of the football, of course not, but because of the politics of the preference, the political preference. So how this atmosphere around politicians and politics tend to go to the field also. So I don't know, there's something like that.
Yeah, this is really important, that it's what's happening in politics and media, and it's coming into football as well. And we can see, so you reminded me of a really good point as well, which was in the European Championship finals last year, England played Italy.
Yeah.
and right-wing groups around Europe supported Italy because they were white, and England A had black players and B were taking the knee, and therefore so that again that those political stories were being reflected in football. And there was even England fans who said they won't support England because they're taking, these players are taking the knee, and it's like, okay. So you can see how the politics is being mapped onto football in a different way.
Yeah, that's interesting. Any other question for Mark? Rolando? All right.
No. I think everything's explained. Just I want to make a comment. Like I talked about that before in the other encounters. I think it's very easy to be racist and abusive using the internet, because you can hide very easily, right? And until we have like I don't know, one student talk about accountability, right? And until someone take legal actions against those people, is going to happen. We need a power force. Everybody has to work together, and this kind of things that are happening right now, the dividing the society, is not good. It's going to get worse and worse and worse, I think. So I think your work, your research is very important to help to understand the situation and create methods to improve not only sports but our society in general. And I hope other researchers like yours are made in the future, so help everybody to understand what's going on and to make a better world, not only in sports. Thank you very much for attention and everything.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Mark, thank you very much. It's very interesting, your work, not only on online hate, but I also love your work on ultras and supporters. I believe we have a lot of things to talk about, maybe on another opportunity. But it's so great that you could be here with us and share something of your research. And thank you very much. Thank you everybody for listening. Thank you everybody to being at our seminar or for encounters. I hope and I believe that you enjoyed it. And have a lot of things to think about sports, media, and communication. This was the idea, and now platforms and hate speech, it's something that interests us too. And all right, thank you, Anderson. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mark. I don't know if you have any last words for our audience, please.
I say thank you for listening. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your kind words, Rolando. I would just like to come back to Rolando's words, which were, as academics and as journalists and as people in the world, I think we all can do something to make a change. And I think we do need the world to be more united rather than divided. I think the future is not going to look very good otherwise. We've got climate change and other issues. So, I think we can try and work together. And hopefully sport is one of those ways where we can do that. And football and things can showcase that. So, muito obrigado. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado.
Obrigado. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Mário. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tchau, tchau, pessoal.
Obrigada, professor. Até, tchau, tchau.